So now, at the end of our policy, we have a set of Q&As that we're going to go through briefly, and so Kevin and I kind of bounce back and forth with things.
And a couple of things, two things. First, you can ask questions whenever. You don't need to wait until the end. The other thing, too, is we didn't really get into this starting here, but when we did our presentations, we did a modified version of this to PBS. We basically said to people, we embrace social networks. We want you to feel like that you should be comfortable on them. We want you to be out there using them. Not only as promotional vehicles for PBS, but it's a smart thing to do in this day and age. But just to be careful and use these parameters. So, and I'm saying this because a lot of times when people see an email with the subject, social media policy for employees, they're going to think, what's this mean? How am I going to get shut down? So we really try to mitigate that by saying, we want you out there, but be smart about it. And that was the genesis for a lot of this work. So what we did is we did this presentation, and the questions that came up quite a lot, we kind of culled those out. So those are some of the things that we're going to talk about right now, and then get into other Q&A with you. So the policy, the first question is, who does it apply to? And it not only applies to PBS employees, but all the people who have been hired to blog or post on pbs.org. So that includes people like Mark Glazer, who does our Media Shift blog. So he has a copy of these, and we actually had him take a look at the policies when they were in the review process to just get his gut reaction to them. And that was actually really helpful. If you're considering doing something like that, and you have people who are in that kind of capacity, who, if you have a blogger, for instance, who you trust, who you think might have good instincts on this kind of thing, it would be a smart thing for you to do, to have them take a look at the policy while it's in process. So that's been helpful for us as well. Then did you want to?
Okay, yeah. I'll stand up just because I'm having a hard time standing still. But
you're fine.
I'm trying to stay here for you. So this was one of the questions that came up from a lot of people. Does this apply outside of work? And we were probably more worried about this question and how people might respond to the answer than really how it played out. So the answer is yes. It does apply to what people are doing outside of work. Like I mentioned, my small example with talking, to some people, and then people starting to connect my Twitter account to my job. But yeah, the things that you're doing can outside of work can have an impact. And probably most of people's interactions on social media are outside of work. Right? We do have people who do post on Twitter or run Facebook accounts for a variety of different places, for a variety of different things off of our website. But a lot of the things that people are doing in social media are outside of the scope of their work. And those things can create risks. We had somebody ask the question of well, what if my wife posts something negative about PBS? Am I going to be responsible for that? Or what if it's my friend or my friend's friend that I met at a cocktail party or whatever? And so we try to kind of bring that in to be a little bit more realistic and say, look, to the extent that and one of the answers I gave was, to the extent that if my wife were to say something negative about PBS or my boss, I would expect the next day when I showed up at work that I was going to get a call from my boss. Right? That you do need to be careful about the things that you're saying, that these things, that because it's so easy to tie people back to their different jobs, that the things that you're doing outside of work are still covered by this.
I have a question
Wait.
about that.
Can I ask you that?
Yeah.
Yes. Go ahead. Sorry.
Beyond the issue that they're responsible, what recourse would you as PBS take for an employee? Do you legally have a recourse there, or is it just a reprimand, or what happens?
So for the employee?
Yeah.
It's probably a reprimand.
A reprimand.
Right.
It depends what they
But
say.
it depends what they say, right? If it's something that could have got them fired for doing it at work, then it would kind of, I think, be analyzed along those same lines.
And a lot of the things, it would just be, that was not smart.
That's right. So think about it. So the example I gave, and this was the example someone presented to me, that if my wife said something negative about my boss's boss on Facebook, and somehow that made it back to my boss, what would happen? Well, I'd probably get called and yelled at, but would I get fired? No.
Yeah, a lot of it is just be smart.
Be smart. Like, well, why? What does that mean? You're telling people. What I mean? Like, this kind of goes back to some of the HR issues that, if people just are thinking, and being a little bit more careful about what they say in these places, that hopefully they can prevent.
We should say HR was actively involved in this process all along the way, so they saw all the different versions of the social media policy.
May I just say that, it sounds like the same policy that you have, what they do at work is a similar policy you would have for what they do outside of work. So
Yeah.
if they did something in work, it would be a reprimand, but if they did it outside of work, so is it any different in or outside of work, how you would handle it?
It probably, I mean, and this came up several times when people would ask questions during our brown bags. And Mark and I would answer, and we kind of see where we felt. So my opinion on this is, it's slightly different outside of work, but still you can, as Mark said, you really can tie people back to their previous employment. Because of search engines and because of networks, it's very, very easy. All of us have seen things where people thought that they were doing something anonymously, and an entrepreneurial reporter has connected things together. It's very, very easy to connect. So if people do something that's outlandish or just stupid on a social network, yeah, they're going to be called on it. But I think in the great majority of instances, especially after having these conversations with everyone at PBS, they're just, hopefully they're not censoring themselves, but they're just more mindful of what's correct when they're outside of work.
It's easier to think of the extreme examples, kind of
Right.
where those problems would be. We're probably never going to, none of us probably ever have to deal with those. Maybe those ones that are closer in the gray space. We haven't had this issue come up yet, so it's still theoretical. So we're trying, like, hopefully we won't. And that's been a big part of our policy push, is to educate people, so that we don't have to deal with that.
And having them ask questions helps us too, because the question about spouses came up at one of the brown bags.
And we were like, that's an interesting
We
question.
have not had that
Yeah,
before.
yeah.
I guess I just want to clarify around the spouse issue. So when you say they get, if my wife mouthed off on da-da-da about my boss and I got called in, are you saying that's an actual reprimand that's going to be recorded?
So I should take a step back. So I'm not saying anything. So I'm just, we have not dealt with that, right? And I'm not going to give any advice on how you should deal with it, because that would be up to you. I was just, in the question that was presented to me, I was like, I would expect to get reprimanded. Whether, I don't know how it would play out. So in reality,
So you as PBS have not decided what your policy is going to be around if a spouse or someone who's closely related to you makes a statement on social media.
I think that that's fair to say. Yeah.
Yeah, and because it's not the actual employee, it's a much higher level of outlandishness you'd have to look for it to be problematic.
So this is probably a bad example.
Yeah, I don't think there are going to be very many instances where someone who's not the employee is going to create a problem for the employee by something that they say. That would be my opinion.
That just sends up a red flag for me. That a person can be held responsible for somebody else's actions. That's kind of.
And that's fair. That's fair.
Well,
So-
I don't know.
yeah, you look at what happened with Justice Thomas and his wife. She made a phone call that she probably shouldn't have made, and it reflected on him, which is unfortunate.
But he has his job forever.
Right.
He does,
But so, and take that even further. Take that even further, like to something that was even more extreme of a statement. I don't know how exactly what we deal. We haven't had to deal with it.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of I think it's a little bit of an, I don't know, an extreme case anyway. It seems unlikely, right?
Right.
I don't know how we do it. I think that that's a great example, right? That created PR issues for Justice Thomas, right? And if that
He's kind of
happened,
had PR issues for
Well,
about 20 years now. I don't think that's a.
right? But if you
So
switch
wasn't him.
if you switch the scenario and it was a company,
Mhm.
you know what I mean? Like you can think of how, and if let's say it was something even more inflammatory, right? Then I don't know how we would deal with it. But my answer, when I was just trying to be honest, like I would expect my boss, who's a general counsel at PBS, to call in and say, "So what's going on?" You know what I mean? Like what's up here? Whether that can be fired, I doubt it.
But if someone says, I hate Nova,
Yeah, I know.
that's the kind of thing. You'd have to have something terrible in order for this scenario to come up.
I probably shouldn't have used that example. Sorry, I've thrown everybody off here. Go ahead.
What about, like on my Facebook page, I have friends from conservative to liberal. And sometimes discussion happens. So how is that handled? Or is it a problem?
That's a very good question, and we try to be very careful not to tell people that they can't express political views, which clearly, we feel like they can. How would that? First, we go back to the first principles, right? You're responsible for the things that you post. So if somebody posts something to your Facebook page that is political or inflammatory or really maybe you disagree with or whatever it might be, that person's responsible for it, not the individual. So I'd start with that. So people are having discussions and it gets, I don't know, it gets racial or it gets something that's really problematic, you can always delete that. But if you didn't, or because you didn't notice it or whatever, under our policy, that's what I think we would go back to. Say, look, you're responsible for what you write. You're not necessarily responsible for what other people post. Other questions? I'm sorry for throwing out that bad example. So hopefully no one's wife or husband will ever post anything negative about your employer. Okay. Can PBS be held liable for tweets by employees? This goes back to those cases. So we put this in the Q&A because we thought people would probably ask this question, but I've already kind of talked through this. This is still me, right?
Yep.
So if one of the employees is tweeting something and they say something about the company that we don't like, what can we do? And this kind of goes back to the question that we were asking before, right? It depends. Right? Certain types of activities could lead to disciplinary action. And we kind of, like I said, and I'm trying to kind of keep this open, we haven't had really very many issues yet. So we haven't had to deal with these things specifically. And it kind of gets back to just the HR risk around this. There could be potential legal liability back to PBS. Those are the things we'd probably get more worried about and more involved with. But it's going to depend on the situation, what they said, what the context was, and all the factors we've gone through. Any questions on that? And if you have questions, like Kevin was saying, please feel free. I could give another inflammatory example, but I'll generally.
I'm just wondering, in terms of sort of the logical next step of this, does PBS do social media monitoring, and who handles that? Like, we do monitoring for within the communications department of things that have promotional marketing kind of value, but we do not currently extend that beyond the marketing aspect, looking for is anybody doing anything they shouldn't be doing. I'm just curious.
We do monitoring, but it's mentions of PBS or things that we're doing, or shows. So it extends to that.
You're not like looking for individual employees to be saying something about like, this company I work for, blah, blah, blah.
Nothing.
No. And there's actually a great example of, this is actually a really bad example, but it's instructive for some of this monitoring, right, and how easy it can be. I think people call it the Fatty Cisco case. Do people know the story? There was a woman who was interviewing for a job with Cisco, and she tweeted out. So some people remember this. She tweeted out, "Oh, I'm trying to debate if I want to take this job at Cisco with a long commute, and is the fatty paycheck enough to make it worthwhile?" And but I don't really. But the work's going to suck. It was something like that. That's right. It was something really negative about the work. Great pay. I don't know if I want it. Right. And this was a year ago, in the middle of the recession.
And she was still interviewing for the job?
She was still interviewing.
All right, she's stupid.
And so Cisco. This is Cisco, right? Do you think that they don't have Google alerts on this stuff? So some senior manager saw this, like did a Twitter search on Cisco. What are people saying today about Cisco? Saw this, tweeted back to her and said, "Oh, don't you think people at Cisco pay any attention to Twitter?" And it blew up into this whole thing. People created the Fatty Cisco employee website, and she got her 15 minutes of fame out of this. Well, it turns out it was an internship, and the fatty paycheck may have been tongue-in-cheek, that she wasn't really getting paid, if at all. So it was, but it blew up into this whole big thing. But the question was on monitoring. Well, somebody just randomly, like checking out Twitter, what are people saying about Cisco today, and caught this.